So my name is Victoria Phillips. I'm a vector ecologist with the Santa Clara County Vector Control District. So I'm here to basically talk about the services that we provide at Santa Clara County Vector Control and some of the vectors that you probably encounter in your area and some of the things you can do to mitigate them. So just a bit of background on our district. So our district was formed in 1988. And so it's one of 6 in the state where we're managed by the County Board of Supervisors. And a lot of our funding comes from the countywide property benefit assessment. So that's where our funding comes from. So we serve the county, we serve the public. And the reason that we're here is because of vectors that we'll get into in a minute, but basically animals and insects that are capable of causing discomfort to the public. And so we're here to mitigate those issues for the public. So as for our district, we have over 40 staff and they have all different jobs. So we have management, of course, which is self-explanatory. We have front desk staff. So these are the people that you would talk to when you're asking for service requests or asking for information. Outreach, so that's like people like Chris that's on the call. They travel around to different cities or schools providing informational stuff or education about vectors and how to prevent any diseases that are associated with them. And then we have technicians. So the technicians are the people that are out on the ground, mitigating sources of vectors and communicating with the public about the different issues. So if you call us and have an issue with rodents, the technicians are the ones that are going to come out and meet you and help you with that problem. And then on the surveillance side of things, that's where I am. So we basically do surveillance for primarily insects that cause disease. So especially mosquitoes or arachnids like ticks that put the public at risk of contracting different diseases. So what services do we offer? So again, so for surveillance, we're detecting the presence and the prevalence of different vector-borne diseases. So we want to know which parks have Lyme disease, so which parks are at highest risk of contracting disease. We also do surveillance for the West Nile virus, which we'll get into, so we can let the public know if they're at risk of contracting West Nile virus. We have our technicians who regularly inspect mosquito sources and treat them if need be. And we also do a lot of customer initiated service requests. So if you're having issues with rodents in your home, that's when you give us a call and then we'll come out and help you and give you recommendations of how to solve that problem. And then of course, we present at schools and we identify insects and other arthropods as well. So if you have an insect in your home that's causing a problem, but you don't know what it is, you can always send that in to us and we can give you an identification. So how do you actually submit a service request? So at the end of this presentation, you'll hear about 3 or 4 different vectors that might be a nuisance to you. And so if you're wondering, how do you get in contact with us to get our help? We do have an online webpage. So if you search the Vector Control District of Santa Clara County, you'll find our page and you can submit a service request online. If you prefer to talk to someone, you can always call our office and talk to Sonia or Marlene who are at the front desk and they can process a service request that way as well. So generally, when we're looking at service requests across the county, so this is a countywide map of all the service requests that we have, you'll see the majority of them tend to be rodent related because that tends to be the biggest nuisance inside people's homes. But we do get a lot of calls about mosquito fish, which I'll let you know about. They basically eat mosquito larvae. And then we have other things dependent on the year, skunks, raccoons, coyotes, as well as mosquitoes. So the majority of our service requests do come from San Jose because that composes the majority of our county. But we do have quite a few from other areas, including Los Altos. So as for Los Altos specifically, these are where the service requests are distributed, so pretty evenly throughout the area. And the majority of the requests are rodents. So we will touch on that today about different rodent issues and how to mitigate problems that you have in your home with rodents. And then the other largest portion is mosquito fish, which again, we'll get into later on. So just looking at, this is again, just distribution of the service requests in Los Altos. So mosquito fish and rodents tend to be the most requested things from the area, but we do get wasp, yellow jacket requests as well. And that's something that we can also help you with. So the primary thing is, what is a vector? We're the vector control district. So what is it that we're actually controlling? So a vector is any animal that's capable of causing nuisance, injury, or disease transmission to people. So this includes mosquitoes and ticks, which can transmit diseases, as well as flies and rodents. So they can have health associated issues, but they could also just be a nuisance. People don't want rodents in their home. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that causes disease. If it's something that irritates the public, then that can be considered a vector. So in Santa Clara County, we have several vectors or things that are issues to the public. So we have mosquitoes and ticks, of course, and then things like coyotes, skunks, bats, raccoons, possums, rodents, rattlesnakes. So again, these can all be of health concern and they can transmit disease one way or another, but primarily the issues with things like coyotes and raccoons is more of a nuisance of like them getting into your garbage or they're a danger to your pets, not necessarily on the disease side. So here are just some images so you can see different vectors that we have. You can see some horseflies, we have kissing bugs, snakes, mites, but we're only going to touch on a few of these today. So these are the primary ones that we'll focus on. We'll focus on mosquitoes and ticks. We'll dabble on fleas when we come to rodents, and then we'll talk a bit about coyotes as well. So we're going to start with rodents. So there are primarily three rodents that we focus on usually, and it's roof rats. So these are the ones that you tend to find in your attic. We have Norway rats. These tend to be more associated with unhoused residence encampments or basement areas. They're not going to be as up high. And then, of course, house mice, the typical celebrated mouse in the house. So we have ongoing issues. They tend to inhabit the home with you. People don't like having rats or mice in the house, which is fair enough. They steal your food, contaminate your food, and you don't want the droppings around, and they can cause different diseases. So we're here to help with that. Typically, most of the issues that we encounter are with roof rats and Norway rats. These tend to be the nuisance species in residential areas. And when you're looking to see, say you don't know if you have a rat problem, you hear some scuttling in the walls and you're not sure what to look for, there are some things that you can check out. So rub marks are one. So if you look at the lower right image, you'll see that there's this dark staining. And so the dark staining occurs when the rats are moving through an area constantly. And so their fur rubs off on the wood and they're not the best at cleaning themselves. So it eventually causes this dark stain. I notice it as well, like with house cats, you'll see it like on the corners of walls because they rub their cheeks on the wall all the time. So it eventually creates this black staining. You also see droppings, of course, as well as gnawed wood. So a lot of times you'll see this outside on fence posts. You'll see posts are gnawed because their incisors constantly grow. So they have to chew to be able to keep them at a reasonable length. And some health issues that are associated with rodents. We have tropical rat mites as one. So if you do have especially rats in your walls, what can happen is you have mites that are associated with them and they start detecting that there's other animals around that they can feed on, and then they will come out from the walls and into the room. So I have had this with several service requests I've had where we identified tropical rat mites, and it was because they had rats in the wall. So the tropical rat mites were biting people. So that's something to be aware of. We also have hantavirus. So this is more associated with deer mice. So hantavirus doesn't tend to be something that's associated in residential urban areas. Deer mice tend to inhabit abandoned cabins and old barns and structures a little further out. But it is something to be aware of, and we'll go into that, as well as flea-borne typhus. So this is something that's typically caused by cat fleas. So this is our little dabble into the world of fleas, but I'll go over that again in a minute. So what actually attracts rodents to your home? So you have a rodent problem. What is it that's causing them to come to your home and not your neighbors or the guy down the street? So a lot of times it has to do with preference of habitat. So if you have a lot of unmanaged vegetation, you have a lot of fruit trees, you have a lot of shrubbery, that creates both great habitat and a food source for the rodents. Garbage is always a big one that comes into things with coyotes and raccoons and a lot of other animals as well. If you have trash cans outside that aren't sealed or are open, then you're just basically putting a giant pile of food out for all the animals. Crawl spaces that aren't well sealed. So if you have holes, and especially in the wintertime, animals are trying to find warm areas to nest. And so that's a convenient way for them to get in. As well as things like telephone poles and cables that are linking to your attic or above your roof. Those are other ways that they can get in as well. So there's a lot of information on the slide, but I'll break it down for you. So typically when people call us about rodents, it's because they are either having problems within the home or they're having problems outside of the home. So that's why we separate the two. So either way, if you're having a problem in the home or outside, I always recommend giving us a call for a service request. Again, if we serve the public, it's completely free to you, or getting in contact with a pest control company. The reason being is that they can identify what species of rodent it is that you're dealing with, and then that'll help you with the mitigation measures. And they can also help you kind of figure out where the rodents are getting in, which is a really important part of this. So in the home, removing the food sources is important. House mice, for example, they really like to feed on pantry items like grains, cereals, things like that. So you need to make sure that access to your pantry is sealed off. Removing crumbs, making sure that you're keeping a clean home. You don't want crumbs piling up under your fridge, as well as, again, covering garbage cans. If you have a garbage can in the home and you have a rodent problem, make sure that your garbage can is sealed. So now that you have rodents in the home, how do you actually get them out? So what we typically recommend is exclusion. So the way that you go about this is go around your home, identify all of the ways that they're getting in, and seal them all off. So you can seal them off with steel wool and then use foam around the outside. There's a foam spray that you can get. This will seal off that hole, but you want to leave one open, right? Because rodents tend to be nocturnal, and so they'll be more active at night. So you leave one hole open and you just put a paper towel or something that can move. And when you later on in the evening, you see the paper towel has been moved, you know the rodents have left, and then you can make that final seal. So that's one thing that you can do. If that's not helping, or it's just not really an option dependent on your situation, trapping is always an option. I do never recommend glue traps because they're just not really humane, kind of gluing an animal down, as well as, especially if you end up using them outside, you might not trap a rodent, you could trap squirrels, you could trap lizards, and there's no way to really get them out. And then we have things like pesticides and anticoagulants. Again, we don't really recommend using these because those baits may be used by things other than rodents. And so coyotes, for example, will eat those, and we've found evidence. There's a lot of studies that have come out about anticoagulants building up in systems and killing other animals. So it's just something to keep in mind. So snap traps tend to be the way to go. But again, if you give someone a call, pest control company or us, we can give you more fine-tuned recommendations. As for outside, so typically the issues that happen outside of the home are when people have vegetable gardens. And so they have all these vegetables they spend all this time growing and building. And then rats come along and eat all the veg that you've worked so hard for. So the primary things with that is to clear up the yard. You don't want any areas that they can use as passageways, because rodents are going to typically travel along fence lines, and they need cover because they want to be free from predators. So you want to move wood piles, clear out dense vegetation, basically hiding places for rodents. And then something that I found recently that has been recommended multiple times is a homemade pepper spray. So it's something that you can do is kind of grind up and blend up a bunch of peppers and mix it with water, put it in a spray bottle, and you can spray it along your fence line, on your vegetables. And so it will take a couple times for the rats to get used to this and recognize that, hey, I don't want to eat these vegetables. It's spicy, it hurts. But it will work eventually. And a lot of people have had success with it. It's never an end all be all answer. Sometimes things don't work for other people, but there has been some good reports with that. And just make sure that you reapply because it is water based. So you don't want to just apply once because it will disintegrate with the sun. Mothballs are also an option under decks. So again, these are some things that you can do in your home and outside if you're having issues, but we can give you more fine-tuned recommendations with service requests with the pest control company. So now that you know all about the rodents inside your home, what are some things that Santa Clara County Vector Control is doing for surveillance for these diseases? So we have flea-borne typhus surveillance that we're doing. There was a case of flea-borne typhus in San Diego, and so that kind of prompted statewide surveillance in California. So what we've been doing is going to unhoused resident camps, and we trap Norway rats, and then we collect the fleas from those rats and test them for marine typhus, as well as flea-borne typhus. So that's one of the measures that we're taking. And so you can see in these photos, we have Chris and Brenton combing rats. We have some of our technicians trapping rats, and some of the habitats that we're finding these rats in. You may remember the other disease that I mentioned was hantavirus. So this is primarily associated with deer mice and tends to be more out near campgrounds and county parks and things like that. But it has been found in Yosemite campgrounds as well as Santa Cruz County. So we do surveillance every year for this virus. But the main takeaway that I would like for everyone to get from this is don't enter enclosed spaces where you're seeing deer mice activities. So primarily if you're just seeing fresh droppings, don't enter the enclosed space because it's a respiratory disease. So inhaling the particles that are coming off from the rodent feces is what is going to get you sick. So don't enter like sheds, barns, things like that without respiratory protection. So moving on from rodents, so that was the #1 call that we get from Los Altos County. The other one that I would like to get into in terms of vertebrates is coyotes, because we do have an increasing number of calls about coyotes. So where do coyotes live? So they thrive before humans got here, right? They like forests, grasslands, desert environments, but they're really adaptable. So they will live in large cities, as I'm sure you've seen. It's like LA is having a really big issue with coyotes. So in urban areas, they prefer this patchy habitat. So it tends to be along riparian areas or golf courses, anywhere that's still providing them some of that natural environment, but in an urban world. So here's an example in a minute. So most of the coyote interactions that we have is in the Bay Area and in LA. And this may be more representative of where the majority of the population is in California, but this is where we have the majority of the calls. And so these are those habitat fragments that they're using. So they have food on either side of them, right, from the urban environment, because we have trash, we have pets, cats, and things that are running around. And I think cats constitute about 30% of a coyote's diet in urban areas. So that's another reason you want to keep your cats inside. But this is what they're using. So usually these habitat fragments in urban areas, but also in Los Altos, you're pretty close to county parks. So it's easy for a coyote to wander into the territory. And so one of the things that we get a lot is calls about coyotes that aren't actually coyotes. So that's the reason that we put this slide in here. So gray foxes are commonly mixed up with coyotes, especially from a distance. But I kind of think of gray foxes as pretty long. It's almost like, a hot dog versus a hamburger. Gray foxes tend to be a lot longer and they have really bushy tails. Coyotes, more than anything, look like dogs, domesticated dogs. They tend to be smaller in size, and they have that pretty typical gradient of coloring where they have almost reddish orange coats with gray interspersed. So it's almost that wolf-like coating, but instead of with the gray, with more of a reddish color. They have yellow eyes, pointed ears, the bushy tail with the black tip. So those are the things that you typically want to look for. So wild animals, so the issue that we have is that coyotes do play an important role in our ecosystem. They're keystone predators. So they help to keep rodent populations under control. They eat rodents, they eat rabbits, they eat other things like that, that if they didn't have coyotes around, the population would be out of control and we'd be overrun. So it is important that we keep coyotes in our ecosystem. What the problem is that people see a coyote, and sometimes people want to make friends with it and they'll try and feed it. Or people leave food and garbage out, and that's great food for the coyotes. So then they get used to humans. They get used to being around traffic. They get used to the noises and they're not scared anymore. And then that cycle just keeps repeating. And then you have coyotes coming further and further into the urban landscape. So the first and foremost thing that I think is really important to say is coyotes are a natural part of the environment. So we're encroaching on their home. It's not the other way around. When we're building our houses up into the hills, into the parks, into the chaparral habitat, this is where the coyotes live. So we're the ones pushing them out. So it's only natural that they're going to start to become curious. They're going to come into the urban landscape and they're going to try and find food. So, it's not the coyotes' fault is kind of the takeaway there. But there are things that you can do to mitigate your issues with coyotes. One of the primary ones is, of course, to remove food sources. So the big ones for coyotes are garbage. As we talked about with the rodents, with most animals, it helps to just keep garbage sealed, keep it contained. If you need it, there are some places that will supply locked garbage cans. And pet food is another one. People tend to leave pet food, especially cat food, out, and then that attracts coyotes as well. The primary thing for deterring coyotes is something called hazing. So I think a lot of people have heard this term, but it tends to be more deterring the animal from the environment or from the undesirable behaviors as well. So the biggest thing is be loud and be large. So yelling and waving is good, making a lot of noise, banging pots and pans, using whistles, putting a bunch of coins in a can. So this can be helpful if you're out walking your dog, especially in environments if you notice a lot of coyotes around. You want to bring something noisy with you so you can deter the coyote from coming near you. As well as like using a hose, water gun, things like that. So if you're in your yard, you see a coyote, spray it with a hose. And so all of these things, basically, the coyote is going to start associating these negative behaviors with the urban environment. So it's going to kind of start to think, hey, if I go near houses, I'm going to get sprayed with a hose. I'm going to be yelled at. There's going to be loud noises. And I don't want that. So I'm not going to go near the urban environment. In addition to hazing, you can also up your fencing. So if you are having issues with coyotes in your yard and that's something that is a concern to you, you want to make sure that your fencing is 6 feet, but you do not want chain link fencing because they will climb and they also dig. So you want to make sure that your fencing does extend about 1.5 feet down into the ground. Electric fencing is also really useful. So especially if they get a little zap, just like you can use with dogs to keep a dog in your yard, to keep coyotes out of your yard, electric fencing works as well. You can also use things like strobe lights. There's motion activated strobe lights. If you have a larger property that you don't want coyotes on, that's been shown to work as well. And keeping pets safe. So oftentimes the primary concern is somebody has a dog in their backyard, especially smaller dogs, and they're worried about coyotes coming. The main thing is just not to leave your dog unattended. If you have a small dog in the backyard, don't leave it unattended because again, we are in the coyotes environment. So it's only natural that coyotes will be around and it's something to be aware of. And when you are walking your dog, keep your dog on a leash, especially not one of the longer leashes. Keeping it on a 6-foot leash is better because you're keeping your dog near you and you're a big animal. The coyote doesn't really want to mess with you. They want to mess with your dog. So if your dog is near you, then they're going to see that it's protected and they're less likely to come near. So those are all things that you can do. So moving on from our vertebrates, so we went over rodents, we went over coyotes. Now we're going to move into our invertebrates. So the invertebrates that we'll talk about will be ticks and mosquitoes because they are the primary public health concern. So these are ticks that you can see in this image, and on the left is an image of a trail going through habitat. So I'll mention this in a minute, but ticks do tend to congregate along trail edges. And when you're out at county parks, you can start to kind of take a look to your left, to your right, and you'll notice there's a lot of ticks congregating on those grasses. And you'll actually see them actively questing. So that's why it's important to walk in the center of the trail. But if we're looking at common tick species that we have in our area that are a primary health concern to you, probably the most famous tick is Ixodes pacificus. So this is the western black-legged tick. So you can see it in the image in the upper left. You can see a female, a male, and nymph and a larvae. So they are the primary vectors of Lyme disease. So again, Lyme disease tends to be that bullseye rash. So that occurs in 80% of cases. So if you notice that bullseye rash occurring on your body, you should definitely go see a doctor. But they are most active in the colder months. And so I want to highlight that because there is this common misconception that ticks are active in the summer. And I think where that usually comes from is that it's warmer in the summer. That's when people are more active in the woods. And so there tends to be this association, and that's when they see ticks. But the western black-legged tick is actually most active in the cooler months, prefers it to be cooler, especially between about 40 and 60 degrees for the adults. So the adults are most active from November to March. Probably primary activity is January, February. The nymphs, so the nymphs is that third one from the left. They're of the biggest health concern because they are so small. So I will show you an image in a minute that'll really get across the size of them to you. But the reason that they are the primary vectors of Lyme disease is because they're so tiny that people don't find them. So that's why it's important to do thorough tick checks, which I'll go over in a minute. But for these tick species, you're most likely to find them in forested habitats. So deep leaf litter layers, old deciduous forests, that's where they tend to inhabit. But we do have another tick that is also very common in this area, and that is the Dermacentor occidentalis. So this is the Pacific Coast tick. So it's only found here on the west side of the US. And it is the primary vector of Pacific Coast tick fever. So the reason that I want to mention Pacific Coast tick fever is that it is a newly emerging disease. And so in California, it was found in 2008. And there have been a very small number of reported cases, but 2 of those cases have been reported here in Santa Clara County, in the Saratoga area. So that's why I want to bring it to your attention. So these ticks are most active in the warmer months. So typically April to June, like late spring, things are, 70 to 80 degrees. But they're found more in these chaparral habitats, so where it's drier or like drier. Usually these shrubs provide a lot of humidity for them, but outside of that, there's not a lot of shade provided by trees. So you'll find them congregating along edges in this habitat. And I do just want to say that even though we're talking about preferred habitats, ticks can be found in most landscapes. You can even find them in mown lawns. Don't prefer mown lawns, but you can still find them there. So it is important to be aware of ticks, regardless of where you go. So for tick bite prevention and personal protection, when you're out at these parks, because we have gorgeous parks around here, and I would never say don't go out to parks because you're scared of ticks. It's a part of the environment and it's a part of the experience. But wear light colored clothing. And so the reason for this is pretty simple. It's just that it's a lot easier to see ticks. If you're wearing black pants, especially if we look back at the Western black-legged tick, it's going to be a lot harder to see it on your clothes. And so long sleeves and long pants are always recommended because you're creating that seal so the tick isn't as likely to get to your leg. If you are in a tick heavy environment, tucking your pants into your socks can be really helpful as well. And then treating clothes with permethrin or DEET. So permethrin is a substance that will actually soak into your clothes, and it gives ticks hot feet or kills them, and so they'll just fall off of you. DEET is an active repellent, so it works for ticks and mosquitoes. Avoid trail edges like we went over earlier. They congregate along the trails, and then perform regular tick checks. So that includes checking your gear and your clothes, checking yourself before you get in the vehicle, and showering within 2 hours of coming indoors so that you could actually remember to do that full check. And so just remember, ticks like hot, humid environments. So generally, you're not going to find them in obvious areas. They're going to be in warm, moist areas like your armpits, behind your ears, behind your knees. So those are the areas that they'll tend to hide, where you're less likely to see them. So this is the image that I wanted to show you. So this is going to kind of give you a visual of how big ticks are. So this is just a normal size everything bagel from the grocery store. And see if you can find the adult female, the adult male, and the nymph of the Western black-legged tick. So I'll just give you a minute there. See if you can find it. Okay, so here they are. So you can see the adult female, the adult male, and down in the lower right, you can see the nymph. So again, I'm showing you this image to really reiterate the size of ticks, especially the nymphs, and how tiny they are. So all of these life stages can cause disease. They can all cause Lyme disease. So that's why you really want to perform thorough tick checks when you get home from when you're out hiking, camping, or whatever else. But if all else fails, you do find a tick on you, what is it that you can do? So it's important to remove it, of course, but don't burn or smother the tick. That stresses the tick out and can actually increase your chances of infection. So always just pull it out with tweezers or those tick removers. Save the tick, so put it in a Ziploc bag, save it in the freezer, and then monitor yourself for symptoms. So the reason that you want to save it is different ticks are associated with different diseases. So it makes it a lot easier for your doctor to figure out what it is that you've contracted if you save the tick, because they can look at the tick species, see the associated diseases, and it will really reduce the diagnostic time. So what about in your home? So I've had this call a couple of times with different residents who have found ticks in their backyard. So this is very common, unfortunately. And so the reason for this is ticks love humidity. And so these shrubby habitats we create in our backyard that are all these different flowers, like you can see on the right with the trees and the bushes, and it looks beautiful, but it's also providing a lot of humidity, and it's also providing a lot of rodent cover. And so ticks need hosts, and so if there's rodents, it's humid, it's warm, ticks may be there as well. So what can you do to kind of remove tick habitat from around your home? Leaf litter is a really important one. So that buildup of leaf litter that you get in your yard, it's not ideal. We find a lot of ticks in that, and I found that at a lot of residential properties is collecting ticks in the leaf litter. That's where I usually find a lot of them. It's that humidity, because ticks don't drink water, they get it from the air. So if it's dry, they can't survive. So reducing heavy shrubbery, again, for reducing rodents and reducing ticks, it's a great idea. Dry out wood piles, again, that creates moisture, and keep lawns mown so that they're not tall. Mown lawns, the sun gets straight through to the soil and it helps dry things out. Reducing host access, again, they need hosts, so having fencing around your yard that removes deer, so you don't have deer coming through your property, is great. Removing the wood piles and clutter, again, to reduce rodent traffic. And then a lot of suggestions have keeping play equipment and patio furniture away from those edges. A lot of people live near county parks or around parks because it's beautiful, but you do tend to have that barrier where your yard backs up to a county park, so it's residential to this wild space. And so if you have ticks on this side, you want to keep your patio furniture and your play equipment away from that, because ticks do actively travel to different cues. So carbon dioxide, for example, they will travel to. So you want to keep all of that equipment at least 3 feet away from that edge to reduce the chances of ticks coming there. And there are some mitigation measures that you can take for ticks. We are not remotely as up there as we are with mosquitoes and other organisms for mitigation, but acaricides are an option. So there's sprays that you can use. In the Northeast, they use them a lot, and they've been pretty effective. You spray once in the spring and once in the fall. I will say that there are some harmful residuals and they can affect other insects, so that's something that you want to keep in mind. There's also rodent and deer baits. Basically, they get treated with permethrin as they try to access the food, whether it's in the rodent bait box or in the corn rollers. And it treats the animals with permethrin so they don't get ticks. We're kind of breaking that life cycle of the tick, and then that helps reduce populations as well. So moving on from ticks, we're going to move on to the deadliest animal that we have in the world. So just take a minute and think about what you think the deadliest animal is in the world. And this is in terms of the number of deaths that it causes every year. So I'll show you this slide. So we have things like sharks that people are absolutely terrified of. They only kill about 10 people a year. Crocodiles, 1,000 people a year. And then we get up to snakes. Snakes kill about 60,000 people a year. But what is the animal that kills the most people every year? So unfortunately, it is the mosquito. So mosquito kills about 830,000 people a year, and so a lot of those deaths can be attributed to malaria, but they cause a lot of other diseases as well that we'll discuss. So for mosquitoes, there are about 3,500 species across the world, and we have 175 species here in the US. So it's important to note that of these 175 species, not all of them are disease-causing animals. So we only have a few species that we need to worry about for diseases. We have 3 genera in the US. We have Aedes, Anopheles, and Culex. So Culex is the one that we'll focus on today. They're the primary vectors of West Nile virus. But generally, when we're talking about mosquitoes, mosquitoes are small insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts, scaly wings. The males do not feed on blood. That's something that people don't usually know. So the males actually feed on nectar. The reason that the females feed on blood is they need it to produce eggs. So the males aren't producing eggs, so they don't need a blood meal. The females need the blood to produce the eggs. And so, yeah, so the females are the ones who feed on humans, and so the females are the ones that we're concerned about with disease transmission. And so this is the Culex mosquito. So we have Culex pipiens and Culex tarsalis are the ones that we tend to focus on for West Nile virus. They are the primary vectors of West Nile virus, and they're the ones that your vector control district primarily focused on for mitigation efforts. So they're plain brown mosquitoes. So pipiens is called the common house mosquito. So they are around, but they prefer these stinky water sources. But when we're looking here, you can see a male and a female mosquito. And so you can see the male has kind of more flamboyant antennae. They have these puffy antennae on either side, whereas the females, the antennae look a little more boring. So that's how you tell the difference between the males and the females. So there's the antenna there. And so this is the mosquito life cycle. And so the reason that this is important is for mitigation efforts for you to reduce mosquito populations around your home. So mosquitoes spend the first part of their life cycle in the water. And so this can take, depending on the temperature that we're experiencing, this can take, 11 to 14 days, or it can take, a month or two, depending on how warm it is. So they start out as eggs in the water. They lay egg grafts, the Culex species do. They hatch into larvae, and the larvae go through 4 instars. So they molt and get larger, molt and get larger. And eventually they become a pupa. So the pupa is the development phase. This is like the cocoon in a butterfly. So they're in there, they're getting their wings, they're developing their proboscis, and then they emerge as an adult mosquito. So they require water to complete their life cycle, and that's the important part. So for West Nile virus transmission, so West Nile virus is the disease that we primarily focus on here in Santa Clara County. We did have 1 case of it this year, and unfortunately that resident did die. So it is really important to be aware of West Nile virus and mosquito mitigation efforts. So the reason I have this slide up here is just to give you an idea of the transmission cycle. The Culex species, so the Culex tarsalis and pipiens, the ones that are primary vectors of West Nile, we're not their preferred hosts. They prefer feeding on birds. So birds are the ones that are cycling, they are reservoirs for West Nile virus. We're incidental hosts or dead end hosts. So the mosquitoes don't want, they wouldn't pick us. If you put us and a bird in a room, they would pick the bird, but we tend to be incidental hosts because we're also releasing the same cues. We're breathing out carbon dioxide, we're warm, we have blood, which is pretty important. So that's what we have here. And so West Nile virus activity in California. So this was last updated on October 14th. So you can see the distribution of West Nile virus throughout the area. So it is unfortunately an issue throughout the state, but we have had 93 human cases as of October 14th. We had 181 dead birds test positive. We had nearly 3,000 mosquito pools test positive. So it was a very busy season. And for us specifically, we had a pretty busy summer this year, a lot of West Nile virus activity. So what is Santa Clara County actually doing to help and mitigate that risk? So we do a lot of surveillance. So again, this is, I'm a vector ecologist, this is more my side of things. We have routes that encompass the entire county of all the residential areas. And we basically set traps. So you've probably seen us around. We'll set traps out front of people's yards, usually like on the sidewalk, in trees, things like that, where mosquitoes are going to be resting. And we complete these routes bi-weekly so that we're hopefully getting a snapshot of each part of the county every 2 weeks so that we can increase our rates of actually reacting to any West Nile virus presence. So these are the 2 trap types that you probably see out and about. The EVS trap, sometimes it's black, sometimes it has a blue cooler, but they're basically just using different cues. So the gravid trap has stinky water. So again, the Culex, pipiens, and tarsalis like that stinky water. So it's usually hay infused. And the mosquitoes go there to lay their eggs, and then they get sucked up into a fan. For the EVS traps, we're using that carbon dioxide cue. So this is host-seeking mosquitoes that are looking for a blood meal. So they're attracted to the carbon dioxide, and again, they get sucked up into the fans. Then we take those, we test them for diseases, and we let operations know. So operations is divided into all these zones, and all these zones have recorded sources of breeding. So this here is the mosquito larvae in a dipper. So you can see it. So this was one of the sources. So typically you don't find them in running water. So this source was actually a little further back. There was a puddle that had formed on the right side of this creek. But our technicians are out there and they're checking those breeding sources every 2 weeks. If they find breeding, we treat it. So the majority of our efforts are focused on the larval stage. Then we have biological control. So you may remember when we were looking at the service request slide, the second most popular service request in Los Altos was mosquito fish. So that was Gambusia. So this is again free of charge to the public. We will provide mosquito fish to you. So if you have bird baths, you have ponds, you have pools, anything like that in your backyard, those are potential mosquito breeding sources. And we'll provide mosquito fish, and basically they feed on the mosquito larvae. It's a great source of control for mosquitoes. So in terms of what you can do, how do you actually protect yourself from mosquitoes? So there's physical control. So this is, again, reducing those breeding sources because mosquitoes need water to breed in. So if you can reduce sources, if you dump out buckets around your home, removing any of that water, mosquitoes can breed in as small as a quarter size of water. So you want to make sure that you're not accumulating it in toys and other things, especially flower pot basins. Those are really popular breeding sites, as well as increasing the water flow. So if you have, a stream that goes through your backyard and it's been blocked up, removing those twigs and keeping that flow going will reduce mosquito breeding. Mosquitoes don't like to breed in flowing water. They need it to be stagnant. And then around your home, you can look for possible mosquito sources. You can see a ton of them listed here. So open boats, things that sit out that are accumulating rainwater, those are breeding sources. Tires are great for Aedes mosquitoes. We have neglected pools, neglected hot tubs, ponds, anything like that that's going to create that stagnant water. Rain gutters are a really popular one. If those get clogged, then you create that stagnant water above your house, and then you have mosquito breeding in there. But lastly, how do you protect yourself? So protecting yourself is the most important thing because we don't want you to get bit by mosquitoes. So staying inside late evenings and early mornings, because that is when these species that transmit West Nile are most active. Making sure that you don't have holes in your screens or in your windows that mosquitoes can get in, because again, they're attracted to the carbon dioxide, to a couple other cues that we're providing. So they're going to be trying to get to you. So they're detecting that carbon dioxide. They're just going to be flooding around your wall until they find a way in. So you want to make sure that you're not providing that way in for them. When you're out and about, again, wear long sleeves, long pants, loose clothing. The tighter, if it's tight, the mosquito can pierce through your clothes and still bite you. You want to wear light colored clothing, again, so you can see mosquitoes on you. And of course, to use pesticides as well. So DEET, again, is a mosquito repellent and it works really well. Permethrin also works for mosquitoes as well as ticks. So those are options that you have. Some things you can do outside in residential areas is to have the big mosquito nets. You can place those over your picnic tables if you're going to be sitting outside enjoying an evening meal, just to protect yourself from the mosquitoes biting you. So we've gone over rodents, we've gone over coyotes, we've gone over ticks, and we've gone over mosquitoes. So that is all that I have for you today. If you have questions about any other vectors that you're dealing with, you can always contact us. So our website is www.sccvector. So we have information about different vectors on there. We also have our service request page. This is our main office phone number. And yeah, so if you'd like any information about outreach or presentations, you can also contact Chris. We also have Vector Info is the email address that we use. We also have social media accounts where we update on mosquito surveillance and tips and tricks for preventing vector issues in your home and outdoors. So yeah, with that, thank you very much.